What does it feel like to lose a war and still be alive the next morning? What is the first thing a defeated people are forced to do for their captors? How does a free person become property in a single afternoon? And how did that one moment, repeated across 1,000 different cultures, become one of the oldest institutions in human history? Somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, roughly 6,800 BC, a group of people wakes up in a place that is no longer home. The village is gone. The weapons are gone. And for the first time in the story of the species, they belong to someone else. For most of human history, slavery wasn't born from hatred. It was born from a spreadsheet. For nearly 200,000 years of human existence, killing a defeated enemy was the default. A rival hunter-gatherer group had no surplus food, no permanent shelters, nothing worth stealing except weapons and territory. A prisoner was a mouth to feed and a threat to keep alive. So prisoners, in most small-scale societies, simply didn't survive contact. Archaeologist Catherine Cameron of the University of Colorado Boulder has spent years studying exactly this pattern in captive-taking societies across dozens of cultures, and her research points to something uncomfortable. Keeping a defeated person alive isn't the natural instinct. Killing them is. Slavery required someone to override that instinct, and override it on purpose again and again, in places that had never heard of each other. So, what actually changed? Around 10,000 BC, in the same region where wheat and barley were first domesticated, humans did something no species before them had ever managed. They started producing more food than they could eat in a single season. A surplus. And a surplus changes the math of war completely. A captive who once cost more to feed than they were worth suddenly became something else. A set of hands that could work a field the captor no longer had time to work alone. The decision to lower the weapon instead of using it wasn't mercy. It was the first time in human history that a person's labor was worth more than their death. But listen to this. The same word gives it away. Historical linguists tracing the earliest written languages on Earth keep finding the same root shared between two very different words. The word for slave and the word for captured animal. Slavery, in its earliest form, wasn't invented from scratch as a system for controlling people. It was copied almost directly from the much older practice of domesticating livestock. A person, in the eyes of the earliest farming societies, could be managed the same way a herd was managed: fed enough to keep working, contained enough not to run, and owned. That's the turn most people never hear about. Slavery didn't start as a system of racial hatred, or religious justification, or even cruelty for its own sake. It started as an accounting decision made independently in farming societies on nearly every inhabited continent, without those societies ever making contact with each other. Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus River Valley, the Yangtze River Valley, four unrelated civilizations, thousands of kilometers apart, all arrived at the same institution within a few thousand years of each other, simply because they'd all crossed the same threshold: farming, surplus, and property. An accounting decision, though, doesn't stay small for long. By 1754 BC, in the city of Babylon, the practice had grown too large to leave unregulated. King Hammurabi's legal code, one of the oldest surviving sets of written law on Earth, carved into a stone stele now housed in the Louvre, doesn't just mention slavery. It builds an entire legal architecture around it. Rules for buying a person, rules for what happens if a purchased slave turns out to be a runaway, rules for debt slavery where a farmer who couldn't repay a loan could hand over his own children as collateral. Slavery had gone from a battlefield decision to something written into the legal bones of civilization itself. Here's the part almost no one connects to Hammurabi's code. Debt did as much damage as war, maybe more. Anthropologist David Graeber, in his research on the history of debt, traced how ordinary people, not prisoners of war, not foreigners, but a society's own citizens, could fall into slavery simply by owing money they couldn't repay. A single bad harvest. A single unpaid debt. That was sometimes all it took to turn a free farmer into property, without a single soldier ever being involved. Even that wasn't the darkest term. By 550 BC, in the city-state of Athens, the same civilization now remembered for inventing democracy, slavery had stopped being an occasional consequence of war or debt, and had become the engine of the entire economy. Classicist Moses Finley, whose research on ancient economies remains foundational, described Athens as the first true slave society in recorded history, a place where slavery wasn't incidental to daily life, it was structural to it. As many as 30,000 enslaved people were worked, often to death, in the silver mines at Laurion, mining the very metal that funded the Athenian navy and indirectly the birth of Western democracy. The freedom celebrated in the Athenian assembly was purchased, quite literally, with the unfreedom of tens of thousands of people who had no vote, no name in the historical record, and no way out. So what's actually going on here? Rome took the Athenian model and scaled it further still. By the 1st century BC, following the conquest of Gaul, historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of newly enslaved people were flooding into the Roman economy every year. Slavery no longer required a special justification at all. It had simply become the default operating system of an empire, embedded in agriculture, mining, construction, and household life alike, from the wealthiest senator's villa to the smallest rural farm. The question, then, isn't really when slavery began. It's how something built on a cold, practical decision about surplus grain turned, over a few thousand years, into a permanent, self-justifying institution that outlasted every empire that relied on it. That escalation didn't stop in the ancient world. It found its darkest form nearly 3,000 years later. Beginning in the 1440s, Portuguese ships began sailing down the West African coast, and what had been, for most of human history, a system that could happen to anyone, captured soldiers, indebted farmers, defeated rivals of any origin, was rebuilt around something new: permanent, hereditary, race-based ownership. When Portugal and Spain established sugar plantations across the Caribbean and South America, the labor demands were larger than anything the ancient world had ever required, and the justification shifted with it. Slavery stopped being framed as a consequence of war or debt. It was reframed as a permanent biological hierarchy, a lie invented specifically to make an economic system look inevitable and natural. 10,000 years. That's roughly the distance between a farmer in Mesopotamia deciding a captive was worth more alive than dead, and a European ship captain deciding an entire continent's population could be treated as permanently, hereditarily unfree. 10,000 years from an accounting decision to an ideology, and the institution didn't end when most people think it did, either. According to the Walk Free Foundation's Global Slavery Index, an estimated 27 million people are living in conditions of modern slavery today, in debt bondage, forced labor, and human trafficking, on every continent on Earth. Not a relic, not a closed chapter, a continuation. So, what was the first job a human being was ever forced to do against their will? A farmer's field, 10,000 years ago, in a place with no name on any map. Who decided one person could own another? Not one person. Thousands of separate decisions, made independently, in societies that never spoke to each other, all arriving at the same cold arithmetic. Was slavery invented on purpose? At first, barely. It was almost an accident of agriculture, borrowed from the domestication of animals. And why did it appear in nearly every civilization on Earth? Because the moment humans learned to grow more than they needed, they also learned that other people's labor could be treated as a resource. The weapon was lowered 10,000 years ago. In some form, on some continent, it still hasn't fully been raised back.